Hello everyone, today we're going to be talking about pour-over brewing and extraction. Now let me preface by saying that I'm not an expert on brewing or coffee extraction. This video is simply to give you my perspective and some of the things I've learned along the way. Let's dive into it. When we're talking about coffee extraction, we have two major components. We have, of course, our coffee and our water. In the case of coffee brewing, our water acts as our solvent on the thing we want to extract, that thing being our coffee, and the result is that we get a solution or a brew. Because at the end of the day, your coffee is mostly water, the quality of your water is very important. In general, we want to avoid water with very high mineral content or water that is too hard. We want some minerality but not too much. In some regions, depending on where you live, your tap water might be perfect. In other regions, not so much. Here in my city, the water is a little bit too hard, so I make use of a Brita filter, or you can also use bottled water for your brews. Now, when we start looking at our coffee, we know that there is an enormous amount of variety. This being due to processing, the coffee species and variety, or even the country of origin. They all have an impact on the flavor and the extractability of the coffee we get at home. Okay, so we have our two major players, and now I want to dive a little bit more into the coffee extraction and the brewing process. So how I personally like to look at it is as follows. We have our brew, and our brew is composed out of multiple cups. So we have a cup with acid, a cup with sweet, and a cup with bitters. Now this is also a fun experiment you can do at home, is whenever you make your whole brew, you can take multiple cups and divide it into the start of your brew, the middle of your brew, and the end of your brew. And then you're gonna experience that inside of your whole coffee, there are gonna be multiple cups. Each cup on its own is unbalanced, but when we mix them all together, we get a nice balanced brew. Now these cups inside our brew will change depending on the coffee and the variables inside of your recipe. So let's go over those and see which kind of impact they have on the different cups. We'll start with the type of roast for your coffee, which is gonna have a very large impact on the cups you will be able to get inside of your brew. So let's first look at a dark roasted coffee. So when your coffee is roasted very dark, a couple of things happen. The green bean will lose most of its flavor molecules that stand for acidity. So with a very dark roast, the acid cup inside of your brew is mostly going to get lost. One more thing that the roasting process does is it makes the coffee bean more soft and brittle. Because the coffee bean is softer, it becomes easier to extract, moving your brew more towards the sweet and bitter cups. Then next up we have our medium roast. When you have a medium roasted coffee, there's a high likelihood that it's gonna be more the sweet cup. So the sweet cup is gonna have a higher volume than the other cups. And then lastly, we have a light roast. So light roasts are more known for bright and acidic cups. Because they are a lot more dense than your darker roast, they become harder to extract, and they will generally give you more acidity inside of your brew. Now moving on from roasts, I like to talk a little bit about coffee ratios. So with our coffee ratio, we decide two major things. We decide on one hand how much extraction we're going to have. If you have a lot of water, you're going to extract more of the coffee. If you have less water, you're going to extract less. And on the other hand, we have our concentration, also known as TDS. TDS stands for total dissolved solids. You can look at it a little bit like a volume button on the flavor. If you use a lower ratio, your brew is going to be more concentrated. You're going to have more coffee particles inside of your brew, making it taste more strongly. So when we look to ratio, we have a low ratio. Generally, when your ratio is too low, you're gonna have a more concentrated but acidic cup. Then you can have the golden cup, which is more in between. In this case, your ratio is perfectly balanced. It's strong enough while also being the right extraction. And then lastly, we have a ratio that is too high. When your ratio is too high, you're gonna have two problems basically. It's going to be over extracted, giving you mainly the bitter flavors of the coffee, and it's going to be too watery. You have too much water and the coffee inside of your brew is too spread out, making it very hard for you to actually taste what you brewed. Okay, moving on from ratio, let's talk a little bit about grind size. So when we look at our coffee, now of course this is very oversimplified. You can look at it a little bit like this. So this is our piece of coffee bean. Inside the center we have our bitters, and then more on the outside you're going to get the sweetness and the acids. So if we grind very coarse, these boulders are going to be a lot bigger, meaning that we need more power or effort to get extraction deeper inside of the coffee bean. So in general, when we have very coarse grinds, you're going to be extracting more of the acidity, less of the sweetness, and less of the bitters. So a coarse grind is going to add more towards this balance in your cup. And then the finer we go, the easier it becomes for your water to fully penetrate the coffee and extract more flavors. So when you look at a medium grind, we're going to be more focused in the sweet cup, and then with very fine grinds, we're going to get closer to a bitter cup. And then this brings me on to the different stages of brewing. So when we brew our coffee in general, we extract acidity first, sweet second, and bitters third. So depending on which stage of the brew you're in, you're going to give your cup either a bigger volume of acidity, sweetness, or bitters. So let's go into the first step of the brewing process, what is called the blooming or pre-wetting phase. Now the thing that we want to achieve with our blooming phase is we want to evenly pre-wet our coffee, allowing it to get hydrated and also degas the buildup of CO2 present inside of our coffee bean. This process prepares the bed for extraction. Now, some of you might get mad when I say that the bloom is the start of extraction, because the main goal of the bloom is to prepare the bed for extraction. And also, when you add water to your coffee bed, you're going to extract something whether you like it or not. This brings me to the blooming ratio. Because the bloom is in the first part of the brew, where we mostly get acidity, my hypothesis is that if you increase the blooming ratio, you increase two factors. On one hand, we are increasing the extraction efficiency by making sure we properly hydrate the bed and give it time to degas. And on the other hand, by increasing the volume of the bloom, the acidic cup inside of our brew gets more volume. Let's say, for example, for a bloom, I'm using a 1:2 ratio, and this is the amount of acid that comes out of the bloom. Now, in another recipe, I will do a 1:3 ratio. So when we look at the acid cup, it has more volume. Due to higher ratios in the bloom increasing both extraction efficiency and increasing the volume of the acid cup inside of your brew. This makes me think that a higher blooming ratio of a 1:4, for example, will increase perceived brightness inside of your cup and also will increase bitters because the extraction efficiency has also gone up in the process. Now a little bit more on blooming time. In general, most recipes will recommend you to bloom for 30 seconds. However, 30 seconds is not always enough time to fully degas and hydrate your coffee. So depending on which roast you're using, you can opt for a longer blooming time. The longer you bloom, the more extraction efficiency you'll get, moving more from acidity towards bitterness. So a longer blooming time, for example, can be a perfect fit for a light roast, which tends to be more acidic. Now, before I go into the blooming styles, I want to talk a little bit more about the type of brewer that you're using. So when we look at our coffee grounds inside of different brewers, this is what it's going to look like. We have our conical brewer that looks a little bit like this, and we have our flat bottom brewer. Now, one thing you can notice right off the bat is that the conical brewer has more layers and the flat bottom brewer has less. My hypothesis is that because you get more different extraction layers inside of a conical brewer, is going to give you a more layered and complex cup because you have a lot of different levels of extraction going on. While in a flat bottom brewer, we have less layers of extraction, making it a more sweet and balanced cup. Now, what happens when we pour our water on our coffee bed is that first we start with water that is not saturated. So the water stores are completely free to accept in flavor molecules and everything we want to extract. Now, as soon as our water hits our coffee, it will start extracting and start taking in the flavor molecules. So in a way, only the top part of your coffee is going to get extracted by water, while deeper inside the coffee bed, we're going to extract with a coffee solution. This makes it that the top layer of the coffee gets most extracted, giving you more of the bitters inside of your cup. In the middle, we're going to have more sweetness, so it's going to give more to the sweet cup inside of your brew. And then at the end, we have more acidity, so it's going to give you some more in the acid cup inside of your brew. And then this brings me along to blooming styles. So when we have our bloom, sometimes we will adjust the structure of our coffee bed, or we will use some form of agitation in the first stage. Now, what this does is that we have our different layers of coffee here, and by changing the structure or doing agitation, in a way we level out the extraction distribution. So instead of it being 5 or 6 layers, maybe it might turn more into 4 layers. That's why the methods like kubomi and a swirl will give you a sweeter cup. Now with the kubomi, we create a divot inside of the coffee brew, so our water has more chance to penetrate the bottom of the coffee bed, and it evens out the extraction in the first phase. With a swirl, we do something very similar. We take our brewer and swirl it around. The issue with this is that because we're using an outward momentum, some of the fines inside of our coffee grounds can start to clog our filter, which increases the total brew time. Next up, we have a wiggle you can do. Is you take your brewer and you wiggle it from side to side. Because with this you have movements outwards and inwards, it probably gives a little bit less fine migration and helps to not clog your filter as easily. And then lastly, we have stirring. Stirring is a more aggressive method of agitation with your bloom phase, and because it's more aggressive, it causes more micro fines to get through your filter. This causes your coffee to get a little bit more body but less clarity. Now, moving on to the second stage of our brewing process. In the second stage, we can choose to either use one pour or multiple pours. And what this does is with each pour that we add to our recipe, we're going to add two things: increased agitation in our brew and increased extraction. So if we have a recipe, for example, with one pour, like my go-to personal recipe, we're going to get a cup with a lower extraction in general. Personally, I really like more tea-like and soft cups, and that's why I tend to use a one pour recipe. And then as soon as we go to maybe 2, 3 or even 4 pours, we are going to move more and more towards the sweet and bitter flavors. Now, one thing I forgot to mention is when you add agitation on your bed, depending on how you pour, you also change the extraction distribution a little bit inside of the layers of your coffee bed. If you use a low agitation, it's going to look something like this. If you use a higher agitation pour, what is going to happen is that each of these layers is going to deepen a little bit, which causes you to get a little bit more bitterness, sweetness, and less acidity at the end. One more question you might have is, how do I change the agitation when I'm pouring? When it comes to pouring, there are two things you can look at. Are you doing a laminar pour or a turbulent pour? Now, what's a laminar pour and a turbulent one? So whenever you have your kettle, if you want to do a laminar pour, which is low agitation, you want to make sure that the spout of your kettle is as close to the coffee bed as possible and you're pouring very lightly. Or what you can also do is you pour from a height, and you want to make sure that the stream of water breaks up right before it hits the coffee bed. This might look very aggressive, but actually the agitation of your water stays very surface level. Now, with a turbulent pour, we have more agitation. We want to be very aggressive with our pours and not too high or not too close to the coffee bed. One more thing about the brewing time. So we already mentioned that we can increase our blooming time, for example. We can also increase the time of our brew by adding more pours in different stages. The effect of brewing time is as follows. If you have a very short brewing time, you get more inside of the window of acidic to sweet. And the longer your brew is, the more you're going to move towards higher extraction and more bitter flavors. Now again, it really depends on the coffee, for example. If you have a very dark roast and you have a very long brew time, the chances are you're gonna have too many bitter flavors inside of your brew, while a very long brew time for a light coffee might be the sweet spot for you to get enough sweetness and a little bit of florals inside of your brew. One more thing that I forgot to mention is your brewing temperature. Now this one is pretty straightforward. If you use lower brewing temperatures, you're going to extract less than when you're using a higher brewing temperature. I personally like to brew somewhere between 80 to 93 degrees. 80, of course, is going to bring the balance more towards the acidity and sweetness. 93 is going to bring it more towards sweet and bitters. So for a very dark roast, for fermented coffees, I'm going to use 80 degrees all the way up to 88. For medium roast, it'll be somewhere between 88 and 90 degrees. And for a light roast, I typically use 93 degrees of water. Now, when looking at the whole picture, you can see that it might be a little bit confusing because I'm talking about, oh, this step can give you more acidity, step brings more balance to the sweet cup, this step does more bitters. In the end, you want to look at all of your variables together. So when we're talking about brewing a very dark roast, for example, you can see if you choose all the options that give you a lot of bitters, that you're probably going to over extract your coffee. So for example, we have a dark roast, we use a high ratio, we're gonna use 93 degrees of water, we're gonna do 4 pours, and we're going to do a bloom of a 1 to 3 for 2 minutes. With this recipe, for example, we are pushing extraction very, very hard. So we're not gonna get a balanced brew, we're just gonna get a bitter cup of coffee. Same thing goes for a light roast, for example. You choose a light roast, you're going to do a low ratio and then a short bloom, only 1 pour and 80 degrees of water. You're going to get a cup that is mostly acidic and again, not balanced. Now the thing that I mentioned before with ratio is that when you use a light roast, for example, with low ratio, it's going to be a very concentrated acidic cup, while with the dark roast is going to be a very over-extracted watery cup because you used a high ratio. So the trick is a little bit to see which of your steps or which of your choices impact the balance of your cup, and then we want to try to mix and match each type of coffee or recipe to have the balance that we want. The biggest reason why I talk about these different cups inside of your brew instead of talking about extraction is because it gives a little bit more context for me personally when looking at the volume that you use in each stage. That's why I find this perspective so interesting, is because you can really look at your bloom, for example. When you use a higher ratio, you're going to have an acidic cup with a high volume present inside of your brew. When you use maybe 1 or 2 pours, you have a lot more volume in the sweet or the middle of your brew. And if you start adding more volume of your water at the end of the brew, you're going to get a bigger volume of the bitter cup inside of your brew. I hope this is not too complicated. I hope it makes sense. For me, it kind of does, but it's not always easy to tell if it's also useful for you, the viewer. Now, I know I went pretty in depth, it's a lot of information and it's pretty nerdy on how to brew coffee. So before I go, I want to say one more thing. To whoever's watching this video until this point, thank you. And if you're just starting out with coffee, I suggest you keep it simple. Look for different recipes, try them out, and stick with the recipe that's your favorite. Keep brewing with the same recipe over and over, and then at some point it will become easier to understand what is going on or tweak things here and there. Whenever you start experimenting, try to change one variable at a time. As soon as you start changing 2 or more variables, it's going to become very hard for you to understand what is going on and why maybe this cup is acidic and the other cup is too bitter. And the most important thing is for you to enjoy the process and have fun. Thanks to everyone for watching this video. I hope this perspective helps you in your brewing, and I wish you a nice brew.